I don't equate dispersed power or power in the hands of many or flat structures. I don't equate that with a better use of power.
Hi there. Welcome to a new episode of the Days of Change podcast. How much have I been looking forward to today's show because of the guest who joins me for the conversation, but also because of the topic. We will talk about the bright and the dark side of power and what that means for leadership in organizations, but also for ourselves. I also want to talk about whether there's a difference in between how women lead in contrast to men and how we can grow the leadership which is needed in the 21st century. I don't know anybody who has studied those issues more than Julie Diamond from Portland, Oregon, who wrote the book Power, a User's Guide, which I can strongly recommend to everyone who is interested in the subject and who isn't. Julie is the principal of Diamond Leadership. She studied at Antioch College in Ohio and at the University of Bern in Switzerland. And yes, she can talk Swiss German, but I won't test that today as I embarrassed myself already in the recent interview with Daniel Siegrist. Julie writes regularly on Medium, and I will put the link to her articles into the show notes, which you can find on changedays.com/podcast. They're worth the read, each one. I met this remarkable woman 2 years ago when she made her guest appearance at the Berlin Change Days, and I'm so happy that she joins me today. Hi, Julie. It's such a pleasure to having you here on the Days of Change podcast.
Hi, Holger. It's great to be here, and I'm really looking forward to our conversation today.
Julie, in one of your awesome articles, which you published in 2015 with the title Leading Out Loud, you mentioned a story about a time when you were personally hurt by a mean remark somebody had made about you behind your back. Now, probably you don't remember that mean remark, or maybe you do, and I don't want you to repeat it. But knowing you as a very strong person, I would still be interested in hearing more about in which situations you feel misunderstood or even misjudged.
So one of the interesting things about me is that my work, I'm very public. I'm in front of groups a lot. And I'm also kind of a shy person. I'm a sensitive person. I'm easily hurt. It's something my whole life I've had to manage. So I can think of so many situations where I feel, misunderstood, or I have a reflex to want to explain or defend myself. And so it's a constant practice to just not indulge that need. But it happens, it happens all the time. I think we always feel that our intent, what we intend is not always what the impact is on the other person. So the first reflex is to try to explain ourselves.
Okay, you don't come over as a shy person. That's quite interesting. But you are, huh?
Well, I am. I'm a shy person. I enjoy speaking, and yet I'm shy one-to-one. I'm always nervous before I speak to big groups, and yet I also really enjoy it. So it's a paradox. It's a very confusing thing to be human. You're balancing a lot of contradictory things all the time.
Yeah. And I can relate to that very much. I think I'm the same kind of person. So what you just said resonates with what I also read in the same article, and I want to quote a few lines because they sound so nice. You say, for example, that when being criticized, it is the cost of a privilege, like when you are a public persona, and then you say, when you're being yourself, you have to remember you are a handful for others, and that incurs jealousy, resentment, and criticism. And then you continue with a wonderful sentence where you say, let your freak flag fly. You are powerful because of, not in spite of your peculiarities. Is that what you came to learn over time?
Yeah, I have. I think that one of the things that I speak a lot about when I talk about power is that your sort of deepest power comes from your having befriended yourself. Like really, it's your personality that you get behind is a great personal power. But we don't really grow up sort of giving all our different parts equal rights, so to speak. The process of socialization means we like some parts of ourselves more than others, but that really makes us very vulnerable. So really letting ourselves fully be ourselves, getting behind who we are, our different personality traits, I think is a great power. It's our personal power. It's the sort of the foundation of our personal power. By the way, Freak Flag Fly, I think that's a line from the musical Hair. I don't think I can't take credit for that one. I'd like to, but I can't.
Yeah, and we dive deeper into the issue of power, but I want to go back and talk a bit about your early life. You called yourself a Marxist at the time you went to college, and others called you even a radical. Yes, I read that somewhere. And then you seem to have made similar experiences than I did. I mean, let's put it into my words. Those who had started off to change the world for the better have often no insight whatsoever into your own changeability biases and the way they themselves misuse power. Is that what you experienced? I kind of read that between the lines.
Well, I don't want to make a global statement. I think a lot of activists have terrific insight into themselves, especially now. I think sort of the personal growth and activism have come together much more than it did when I went to college. But
right.
I went to Antioch College, a wonderful and very radical progressive school in Ohio in the United States. And it was sort of a hotbed of radicalism. But I was very frustrated with sort of the interactional dynamics and the way the activism was enacted. And at the time, I was also reading a lot of psychology. I was very influenced by the work of Carlos Castaneda. And so I found myself I was reading Jung. And so I found myself in a classic dilemma about sort of the, taking more personal, looking at yourself and what's the role of yourself in what you're doing, and how much can you sort of just fight against something without also seeing the projection of it. It didn't make me popular, but it made me reflective, but not very popular.
Yeah, and I agree with you. It has changed, at least partly. At least some of the activists, not all, have more insight into their personal power and to their personal traits. But sometimes I think if you are really a strong activist following a cause, I mean, you are so much driven by your cause that often the personal relationships, the way you deal with other people, gets forgotten.
So I think I have a more sort of nuanced understanding of it now. So I was struggling with myself, really, I should say now, as an activist. And I was struggling with my own sort of inner antagonisms, what was driving me. I also feel, I just want to say, I feel there is a need for, outrage and anger. I see it now, looking historically. I don't think things move in the world without different types. Everyone has different styles and types. And I want to also sort of honor the various ways that people do manifest their activism. But yeah, I was struggling with it myself. I think I was really, I had thought of myself more as an activist. And then when I was actually in an activist world, I realized that lots of it wasn't natural to me. And it wasn't consistent with how I wanted to be fully.
Yeah. And then you went to Switzerland, and I know we talked about that over a glass of wine 2 years ago, that you were kind of drawn in by Arnold Mendell. So you went to study with him. Why was that? What was so fascinating, or maybe is still fascinating about him?
Yeah, well, that was one of the most important things that I did in my life. Was I was studying education at Antioch, and the professor there, Ben Thompson, who many of us studied with, had met Arnold Mendell at a conference and had really brought his work into his classes. And together with some of my friends, I'd like to name my friend Dawn Mencken, who I followed her to Zurich. She was really much more bold and courageous at the time. And so she encouraged me to go, and I decided to go and study I wasn't a big fan of psychology. Still at the time, I was still in that kind of dilemma between political activism and psychology, and I wasn't a big fan of psychology. But I thought, well, what else am I going to do? And my friends are going. So, but I was really touched and moved by the work that Arnie was doing, and also the accessibility. He was in the midst of, really, he was creating a body of work at the time, and he was in a very experimental phase, and he was so open as a teacher and so inviting. So here I was at 2021, and I was sort of invited in to be part of this group, thinking and exploring and testing out new ideas about personal growth and change. And it was just an amazing creative time.
And that laid the base for the work you're doing now, obviously.
Very much. Absolutely. Absolutely. That led the base for so many things in my life. Absolutely. I was so privileged to be a part of that and to be on the ground floor. If the listeners, if you ever have an opportunity to ever get in the ground floor of something new, don't think twice.
Then you got into the issue of powers. Obviously, you have been working on the issue of power ever since, and you're one of the greatest experts I know about that issue. So let's start simple. What is power? How do you define it?
When I teach, one of the things I say is that whenever anybody asks me how I define power, I allow myself to complain and say, I hate that question. And one of the reasons why it's so difficult to define power is that power is so multidisciplinary. So you can, there's economic power, there's psychology, sociology, leadership, political theory, political science. So there's so many different ways to define power. It depends on your use of it, really. I'm a big fan of the work of Professor of Psychology at Berkeley, Dr. Keltner, and he defines power as a resource, like the ability to withhold or provide resources. And it's very contextual. So, for example, you can influence others. So it's the capacity to influence another state of being or a state of mind through withholding or providing resources. And so I love that definition because you could be a child and, if you scream in a supermarket to get some candy, you're using power because you're depriving your parents of the resource of anonymity or time. They just want to get out quickly, and they don't want everyone to look at them, and doing something to exert an influence, using a resource that's meaningful in that context. So affection, for example, is a resource in an intimate relationship. And so I love that definition, because you don't need a title or status or position to have and use power. Okay.
Is power an inherent trait of leadership? Do leaders always have power, or how are the two concepts related to each other?
Oh, that's a good question.
That's my job, to ask good questions.
Right. You're doing well so far. That's good. So, yeah, well, you could say that the defining element of leadership is that you're given a position of power in order to do things and get things done and achieve sort of the collective goals of an organization. So in a sense, leaders are given a power, the legal authority. You have that role by virtue of the rules of that organization. But that's just one kind of power, and it's not enough to get things done. So power is more than leadership. Yeah. Yeah,
but I would say also other kind of leaders. Non-formal leaders do have a kind of power. Power is one of the elements they use to lead people. Probably.
Yes. So when you said leadership, I was thinking of a formal leader, but absolutely. And that's why how I think about power. I don't know why we say power. It should be plural, powers, because that's one of my basic things is that it's powers. There's so many different kinds of power. And just like Dr. Keltner's definition, it depends on the context. And there's many different ways to use power. It's contested frequently. It doesn't matter your title or your status. And so, yeah, you don't need to have a formal position in order to wield power. And those who do have a formal position frequently experience themselves as powerless, unable to do things, unable to impact or influence.
Right. As a preparation for this talk, I read your book for a second time, and it's really great. And as I said, I want to really personally recommend it to everybody, and thank you that you've written it. Everybody should read it.
Thank you.
The best thing
Thank you.
was that the other day you made me rewatch The Devil Wears Prada, because you mentioned it in your book. It was such a fun to watch it again. I mean, I love Meryl Streep and Hathaway and Stanley Tucci. It was so funny to watch the movie again. And maybe you can describe a little bit, because you do that in your book. What happens to, what's her name? Miranda? Miranda is the name of...
Miranda Priestley.
Miranda Priestley, acted out by Meryl Streep. So what happens to that woman?
Well, I think in my book, I use her as an example of one of the psychological influences of power, which is what they call, what researchers, and this is not my research, but others, that diminished empathy, that people in a high power role tend to sort of see other people in what's called a utilitarian way, as a means to an end. So one of the classic things that Miranda Priestley does in the movie, which is like a sort of a comic device, is that she calls all of her assistants by the same name, Emily, because it's easier for her. Why bother remembering different names when you're a busy person? And it's just annoying that people have to have different names. And so it's such a good example of that. The psychological definition of that is you fail. This is an extremely academic way to say it, but you fail to individuate low power targets. And so what that means is that you don't see people as people. You don't individuate them. They're not like unique individuals, but they're just a group. They're helpers. They're assistants. And so they're all, she calls everybody Emily. And it, and this is, research shows that in a high power role, you do tend to sort of see the group and not the individuals, and you tend to make decisions. And by the way, you really have to. This isn't only a negative trait, but or a characteristic, but you have to sort of sometimes make decisions based on the aggregate, on the whole, and not on every individual instance.
In one of your recent articles, you quote Yuval Noah Harari, who is one of my absolutely favorite authors in the last years. And I don't remember that quote up, but I'm sure I must have read it somewhere. And he says, truth and power can travel together only so far. Sooner or later, they go their separate ways. If you want power, at some point, you will have to spread fictions. If you want to know the truth about the world, at some point, you will have to renounce power. That sounds like power always has this dark side.
So in my book, I say, does power corrupt? Absolutely. I say power corrupts, but it's not inevitable. So it's not, we can learn and we can do things to become more conscious, to use it in a more ethical, conscious way. Other researchers, and I also agree with this, a lot of people say power doesn't so much corrupt as it reveals. It reveals what's already there. There's a famous quote by Abraham Lincoln, which I'm going to now mangle. Any man can stand adversity, but if you really want to test a man's character, give him power. So power really reveals tendencies that are already present. It gives you sort of unfettered access, less oversight. It gives you the means and the opportunity to do things. But the motive, that's what I write in my book, the motive, whether or not and how you use it for yourself, for your own self-interest, or for the greater good, that's really up to you. But it has the potential, yes, to absolutely corrupt and be corrupting, and that dark side is always potential. Yes.
You said before that power is a resource, or at another point you say power is an energy, and as such not good or bad, but as you say, it has the potential to become negative. Obviously we are more aware of the negative aspects of power. I mean, power doesn't have a good reputation, has it? I mean, and there are so very few powerful people that leave a positive image behind. I mean, of course, there's Nelson Mandela. Now already the air gets thin, Mahatma Gandhi, and what other 5 or 6 or 7 people we can name who really left a positive image behind, who were powerful. I mean, even with Barack Obama, our feelings are mixed. I mean, obviously he's a shining star in view of his successor. So why is that we have such a negative image of power?
I question whether that's true, that there are fewer good examples than bad examples.
Sorry, I'm not saying there are few good examples. It's just they don't stick to our minds.
There's also a lot of non-famous leaders. Hundreds and millions of people go to work and have a boss or have a teacher or have a coach or mentor. And so, there's millions of examples we never hear about. And some of them are quite great. I mean, I hear people talk a lot about like wonderful bosses they've had and teachers and whatnot. So it has an incredibly negative reputation. It's almost, the word power is almost synonymous with bad power. And I think that one of the reasons I use the word power and I don't use influence or strength or other words is because I really want us to unpack that sort of negative attitude about power. And I think there's just been so many really bad examples in the world about dominant, awful uses of power. We're only at the beginning of, coming out of feudalism and monarchy and oppression. And in fact, there's a little pendulum swing back towards that. So, our lifespan is too short for us to see that change. But I hope it does. I hope that power, we're going to start to see better and better uses of it in the public eye.
Yes, there are so many good bosses. There are so many good managers. There are many good, powerful people. But obviously, we mainly see those in front of us who misuse power, like of course, the usual suspects. I mean, your current president and the other politicians we have in mind. So it's obviously difficult to get this positive image of power in the light of so many power misusers.
We have a current one of New Zealand just at the time of, this last month in New Zealand, the Prime Minister, Jacinda Ardern, was just showing the world a completely different way to use power. So I just, as we're talking about good and bad, that just popped up.
That's right. And I had her on my list talking about her with you, and that's good that you mention her, because really, yeah, she's obviously somebody who shows a different path. And that brings me to a question I wanted to ask you a little bit later, but let's go into right away. I mean, she is a woman, and we have more female leaders now in the world and in organizations. Do women lead differently? Do women use power differently?
It's very hard for me when I get this question. And by the way, Holger, I get this a lot about men and women and different ways of using power. So as a coach, I'm an executive coach, and I work with men and women, and I work with leaders. And the problems people have are similar. The struggles they have are similar. Sometimes the way they express their struggles differ. Let's contrast Jacinda Ardern with Angela Merkel. Okay, two women, Theresa May. Let's look at all the different styles of women. So if you look at Hillary Clinton, you look at different leaders, female leaders around the world, and you'll see so many different styles. If I were to put just even the Angela Merkel and Jacinda Ardern together in one group, they're very different. It would be very hard for me to say they're similar in a way in contrast to Barack Obama or Donald Trump or whoever else. To me, it's more a question of style of leadership, type of leadership. And women, I think, because there haven't been that many women leaders, when they do lead, we tend to notice their difference more. I think gender role conformity is a bigger issue than gender difference, right? That I think that there's constraints on how men and women have been socialized to act, what's appropriate, and I think it cuts both ways. So I think if we had more fluidity around how men and women were sort of permitted to act and behave, I think we'd see much more variety in both genders.
Let's talk about practical things, how people can actually use their power positively. And you say, at a certain point, you say power is only powerful when we feel it. That's a strong sentence. Can you say more about what that means, feeling power?
In my work, I make a distinction between the power that, there's the power that we have in any given moment. If you're in a position of power or whatever, there's the power people see you as having. And sometimes those are different. And then there's this third thing, which is our subjective sense of power. And my work and research and my experience shows that the way you feel, your momentary sense of capacity to act, how you feel, whether you feel able to influence or impact, really in a way directs your use of power. And one of the paradoxical things is that the more powerful you feel, the better you tend to use power. And the opposite is true, in that the less powerful you feel, the more likely you are to use your power aggressively or in self-serving ways. So if you don't feel powerful, you feel disempowered, or you feel threatened, or you have, you feel in some way inferior, and you're given a position of power, you're given some type of power, you'll use it to promote yourself, to defend yourself, or protect yourself, or boost yourself. And there's a lot of interesting research about this. I see it a lot in my work. So feeling powerful means that you are relying on your inner sense of capacity to be influential and to impact people. And you're not going to be overly tempted to use your role or use something, people's compliance, in order to get things done.
Is that what you call power intelligence?
Yes. So for me, power intelligence, that's right. It includes, it's the healthy use of power. And it includes understanding that your sense of power is as much a part of the equation as any of the power you hold or powers you use. That in fact, how you feel very much goes into how well or how poorly you're using power.
How do you work with top level managers? What advice do you give them, or how do you help them to feel and get a better grip on their sense of power?
Well, one of the things that when I first started coaching and working with leaders, one of the things that really surprised me was how disempowered people feel. People feel frustrated. They feel thwarted. They feel unable to get things done. They complain about the people above them. I was actually quite surprised by that. People have a tendency to begin a coaching process or looking for help by expressing where they feel blocked or an obstacle or unable. And that's a very good entry, because I feel like then you can help people. They're what we would say like triggered. They're in an emotional state, or they feel frustrated. And so I think by starting there, by helping people feel more empowered, it actually flows quite naturally to becoming better at using power. They don't have to use so much force, for example.
I feel that you have also reflected about the new kind of organizations which are currently emerging. You've quoted Moises Naim, who argues that we are indeed in another revolution about power. He says power is shifting downwards, it's more dispersed, distributed, and more available than ever before. So again, before in our conversation, you had the hope that power will be used maybe better in the time to come. But the question is, if we distribute power, will that be any better?
Yeah, that's
another good question.
If we look around, another good question, right? If we look around and we look at distributed forms of power, I'm not sure their power, as I write in some article, power in the hands of the many is used any better than power in the hands of the few. I mean, it can be liberating when power is dispersed. It can be liberating. It can be innovative. It can be freeing. And it could also be mob rule. It could also turn against the rights of minority, as we see. So I don't equate dispersed power or power in the hands of many or flat structures, I don't equate that with a better use of power. A lot of people feel that collapsing hierarchy means that, there's less power, but that just means that power is not in the hierarchy, but it's more dispersed throughout, but there's still power there and there's still power dynamics. And one of the things that I get nervous about is, when there are less titles or fewer titles or no titles, where does power go if you can't see it? Who's got the power? Is it in friendships? Does it go into more sort of insider-outsider clique? And, so there's a lot, like I look at some of the more, tech companies that have very flat structures, self-managed teams, and there's a lot of power dynamics and, you see a lot of accusations of bias, preferentialism, sort of different uses of power. I think maybe there's even more need to learn how to use power when power is dispersed. More people have power, more people need to learn how to use it better.
I think so too. And quite interesting, while you were talking, I thought about the way you describe power in a given system. It sounds really a little bit like energy. There's always a certain amount of energy in the system. It doesn't get more and doesn't get less. So what you basically just said is, in a given system, there's a certain amount of power, whether it's in the hand of few or in the hand of many. And then, of course, you're absolutely right. This is an issue the so-called agile or flat organizations need to deal with. And I mean, some obviously do very well. I mean, if we read Frederic Laloux, Reinventing Organizations, he quotes some good examples like Butzerk in Netherlands and other organizations. But I think that's probably the challenge. I mean, how do we deal with power when it's dispersed, and how do we make sure that the people who get power do not misuse it?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And then you have to factor in, I want to also factor in, so now we're also talking about different types of power. So there's the positional power in an organization, but then you've also got things like informal power based on seniority or based on access to knowledge or resources, or simply being an insider and popular gives you a great deal of knowledge. If you have a loud voice, you dominate meetings. People, there's so much in meetings, you can see people misuse power. They don't have a formal position of power, but they're, using other forms of power. And so I think that's also I want to factor that in as well. So power is in an organization. It's in the hands of many people have power now. And also there's all these other types of, like, let's say, hidden dimensions of power. Yeah, I don't think that changing the structure will just change how people use their power.
So I think many of the people who listen to that podcast and many of the people and companies I deal with nowadays are on the way to flatter and more agile organization. Everybody cries for that, at least here in Europe, and I know in North America it's not much different. What advice would you give, let's say, a company leader or a change manager in an organization which wants to distribute power? What should they observe?
A lot of people feel they focus on hierarchy and going from hierarchical to flat or agile teams, or self-managing teams. So for me, the real big issue is transparency, even more than hierarchy, because I think there's a business case for hierarchy, right? When you have the coordinated actions that have to happen, classic operating rooms, or, cockpit, airplane cockpits, there's a reason for hierarchy. And there's a reason for flat teams, where things need to be done quickly, where there needs to be more creativity, more innovation. But it's the degree of transparency. And that's what I would counsel people. I'd say, how do decisions get made? Who's making the decision, and how can I weigh in? How do I get onto that project group? Who do I, who's got the power, and how do decisions get made? How do I appeal the decision? Where do the rules get created? Is everything equally enforced? So there's still rules and procedures and policies. And for me, it's the transparency that makes it feel safer in an organization, that I know who's got power, I know why, I know how I can get more power, or I know who to go to, I know how to, go somewhere if I have a problem. And it's not just in informal networks of relationships. So that's, for me, that's an important piece.
And that's interesting, because I've been talking to a lot of company leaders of modern organization startups who apply agile practices. And each of them, when I ask them what's the most important thing if you want to introduce agility into organizations, they say it's transparency. So yes, I totally agree. And it's quite interesting, because then, of course, traditionally, the opposite of transparency, that means withholding knowledge, has been a power instrument.
Absolutely. That go back to Harari's quote, truth and power. Exactly. That's right. Hoarding knowledge, hoarding information, not revealing it, has always been a way to hold on to power.
Do you think the world is changing towards a better one? I've recently been discussing Charles Eisenstein, who is an American author. I'm not quite sure whether you're aware of him. And he says a better world is possible if we create better conditions, better societies, better organizations. Pretty romantic in some points. Do you believe we are on the way to better societies despite all the darkness we see around us?
Well, Steven Pinker says the same thing, by the way, that the world is getting kinder and better and less violent. I think that one of the things I always say around this problem is that, or this question, is that our lifespans are so damn short. We don't really, we tend to discuss where things are going in the context of an 80 to 100-year lifespan. And so the genie's out of the bottle, in the sense that certain things have happened that we're never going to go back on. Birth control is not going to be uninvented. So women are in control of their reproductive rights. That means they enter the workforce. The Declaration of Human Rights is out there. Certain things may be curtailed, certain countries may curtail it, but once it's been available, it's very hard to just completely remove it. I think that there can be incredible obstacles. I think in the moment we're seeing a real return to an oppressive way and curtailing of human rights. But I think that once things have happened and they're out in the world, there may be little backsliding, but I think it's very hard to just put it back in the bottle altogether. So it may take a while. I think it's going to take some time, and I think that I think that we're witnessing, just to say, I know I'm taking a long time with this question, but I think we're witnessing an incredible time of uncertainty in our lives. I think that just the last 20, 25 years has been just such a rapid advance, and we're just inundated with new information. We don't yet know how to use social media, the 24/7 news cycle, and things. In the beginning, things we are used against us, that we don't know how to use them properly. And I think that in times of great, great uncertainty, there is always an appreciation of we tend to go back to very, sort of traditional forms of control to try to gain more order. I see this as temporary. I'd like to think that we're going to continue to move forward, but I might not see it in my lifetime.
Julie, I'd like you to contribute a gift to our listeners, which usually is a little kind of a tool or something which they can apply right away today or tomorrow in their family, at their work, something which maybe make them reflect about power or whatever. Do you have something in mind?
Well, yeah, I do, actually. I do. I think, earlier in this conversation, I talked about different types of power. I said, why don't we say powers instead of power? And I'd like to give everybody an opportunity to reflect on that. What are the different powers you have, right? You may feel that you don't have a lot of power, but think about it more deeply. What about personal power? What about relationship power? The power to make friends, or your social intelligence is a kind of power, or knowledge, your expertise, or informal power, your insiderness in a given group, or your degree of comfort in a given organization. I'd like everybody to think about maybe a situation where they feel a little disempowered, where you feel you don't have the power. And then challenge yourself to find a power you do have. Maybe it's a personal power. Maybe it's your expertise or your informal power. Something where you feel you have another kind of power that you can use to impact that situation. When I ask leaders, work with people and I ask them to do that, inevitably people can come up with some little other piece of power that they can have to shift a situation. So that would be my gift.
Thank you. Julie, I have a list of 70 questions in front of me and you don't know them. And I would ask you to give me a number between 1 and 70. And that will be the question I will ask you.
That's really creative. Okay. 59.
What are some of your personal rules that you never break?
I don't eat donuts for breakfast.
Julie, I asked my guests to name a book which had a strong influence on them, and I love the diversity of suggestions. You named 5 books, and I had to choose one. They all sounded interesting to me. Let me just present them, because it would be interesting probably for our listeners to hear what you were reading, or what had an influence on you. There's The Catcher in the Rye of J.D. Salinger. I mean, it must be ages or a different life that I read that. And then Noam Chomsky, Synthetic Structures. I have an idea of it. I don't think I've read it. C.G. Jung, Memories, Dreams, and Reflections, which probably I haven't read, but I might have an idea. And then come 2 books which I actually have read. This is Paul Watzlawick, Pragmatics of Human Communication, and Gregory Bateson's Steps to an Ecology of Mind. Particularly the last 2 books. Also, I think they also had an impact on my life. But I would like to hear from you, and maybe not talking about all 5. Maybe you can choose 2 and talk a little bit about them.
That was one of the hardest questions you asked me, was to single out books that had an impact on my life, because of all the long-term relationships in my life, I would say the most successful and enduring relationships are the ones I've had with books. So they occupy a very special place in my life. And so that was very hard. And that list, I think, I have to say, Pragmatics of Human Communication, Noam Chomsky, Gregory Bateson, those books there, I read in my early 20s. And one of the things that really struck me was the patternedness of behavior, of communication, that there are structures underlying our communication, often invisible, non-conscious structures. I loved how Watzlawick talked about the nonverbal dimension. That was one of my early academic studies, was on nonverbal communication. And he made it so scientific and so regular, and also Bateson himself, also at a larger level, looking more at sort of social phenomena, but applying that same sort of rule-governedness lens to things, which of course was Chomsky's great contribution to linguistics. I should, full disclosure here, my academic degree was in linguistics. So,
oh, really? I didn't know that. That's interesting.
My PhD is in sociolinguistics. So, so that occupied, a huge part of my early intellectual development, I should say. Yeah.
That's interesting. And as I said, Václavic and Gregory Bateson both had a strong impact on me, because when I started to get into this whole profession of organizational development, I started with Robert Dills and Judy Delosier in Santa Cruz. And I remember, I think in 1996, I went into a seminar which they gave, which had the title Foundations of Epistemology, and I had no idea, of course, what epistemology is, and I'm not quite sure whether I know it now. I have a rough idea, and of course,
I was going to say the same thing. By the way, I was just going to say I used to know what that meant, but I'm not sure I know.
Well, yeah. I think Judith at that time used to say, "How to know that we know? How do we know that we know?" Yeah. And that's probably the thing. Yeah. And it still fascinates me. Yeah. So very interesting. And what about C.G. Jung?
C.G. Jung. Yeah. I just realized I wanted to say something about that. So that's a completely different, for me, that occupied a very different part of my development. Same years, in my 20s, these are all things I was really profoundly affected by in my 20s. But Jung's book just really, it blew my mind, because here's somebody whose whole life was spent following their deepest self, tracking their dreams, tracking the unusual experiences they had, sort of diving in and mining their interior life, and using it as a guidepost for their choices in the world and what they would do, not just as an interesting hobby on the side. I'm going to, think about my dreams or journal about my feelings, but his whole life was the pursuit of taking his inner experiences of being comfortable in his interiority, but then also living them in the world itself, or living them out loud outside himself. And that was phenomenal. I just thought that really affected me.
Yeah, and obviously, I mean, the early psychoanalysis is not so en vogue anymore, but do you think C.G. Jung still has to say something to us today?
Oh, so yeah, I mean, just to what you were saying also, in the light of power and power relationships, and also incredible multiple role relationship conflicts and abuse of power, I think there were relationships in those early psychoanalytic communities that in light of today don't really hold up. So yeah, it's a whole different world today. But for me, Jung, yes, what stands for me, what still really resonates for me, and I think is also, very much something that I think has been embedded now in a lot of different lines of inquiry and disciplines, is the sort of purposive or teleological approach, where meaning is not just causality, it's behavior is not just a result of a past cause, but there's also like a forward-looking meaning towards behavior. Behavior has a purpose. And that's something that we're drawn forward in our development. We're not just pushed from behind through early childhood experiences. And I think that for me is just still really it's an incredible explanatory framework and a very valuable one.
We do have a Spotify music playlist. I really like it because it's as diverse as our guests are. It's really worth to look into. And you find the link at our website, which is changedays.com/podcast, or you just go to Spotify and you look for the Days of Change playlist. So I ask my guests to contribute 3 songs, and you, as your Julie, of course, you contributed 4, which is fine. You suggested Midnight Train to Georgia by Gladys Knight, which I didn't know. And then Angel from Montgomery, Bonnie Wright, I also didn't know. But I knew the other 2, which is Can't Take My Eyes Off You, Lauryn Hill. And Lauryn Hill is one of my all-time favorites. And then there is California by Joni Mitchell. And I I would like to talk about maybe California, Joni Mitchell. And I can imagine it has two meanings for you. And I'm just guessing. I'm making wild assumptions now. I mean, the one is Joni Mitchell, which is obviously our generation. And the other thing is California, because I mean, California, at least for us Europeans, California is such a magical name, a dream name. So what's California of Joni Mitchell for you?
You know, I can't help but noticing that all the authors I gave were male and all the music I gave were female.
Right.
So I don't know if that meaning, maybe the listeners will put some meaning into that. That album, Joni Mitchell herself, was like a soundtrack for my teenage years. There's something, I'm not sure California was part of what drew me to that song, but the song expresses a incredible wistfulness and longing. And that's what I think that's one of the things, besides it being a beautiful song, but that sense of longing to go back to something, or longing, I don't know, teenage angst. I listened to it over again, as I was 16, 17. And right. I think it just expressed whatever angst I was experiencing, I think was really mirrored by the wistfulness of that song.
Yeah, that rings a bell. I remember that time.
Yeah.
Long hair, beard, and things like that. Yeah. And other things we don't want to talk about nowadays.
Right, and then the other stuff, right?
Exactly. Yes, exactly. Julie, you honored the Berlin Change Days 2 years ago with your great keynote, and you also gave a workshop on your favorite subject, power. I would like to ask you, what impression did the Change Days leave on you?
Oh, it's funny you asked me that now, because I just yesterday was talking to somebody, a younger colleague who's starting out, and I had this impulse. Out of the blue, I said to her, you really should go to the Berlin Change Days. Because I was thinking, one of the things about it was so phenomenal was the community and the people there. What I didn't know and what I didn't, I guess, expect was just, first of all, how many people are sort of lifers, as we say, repeat customers. They go back and back, and it's sort of like a cross between like a great conference and Burning Man. In a way, it's a beautiful picture of community. I think it's very open. There's a lot of sharing. There's a lot of collaboration. There's a great sense of sort of egalitarian spirit, and just great thinkers and practitioners, very practical. So very unlike any conference I'd been to.
I'm flashed that you related the Berlin Change Days to the Burning Man. Thank you very much. It's a bit smaller, but yes. And this year, from November 1st to 3rd, we have the topic Exploring Spaces for Change. So we will look at inner, outer, and cyberspaces and try to bring these three different kind of spaces together. Will be exciting.
Oh, wonderful. Creative. Love it.
Julie, that was a wonderful interview. It's always so great talking to you, and I'm happy that our paths crossed and will cross again and again in life. So you are a true friend, and thanks for making time available and for being on this show. It was a great conversation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Holger. It was a terrific opportunity. Thanks for inviting me, and I look forward to more conversation.